everybody, this is Munson Steed, and welcome to Arts and Culture. There is culture, and there are culture creators. There are those who have won Pulitzer Prizes and being recognized for their genius. There are those who are committed to going in spaces and creating new spaces for future generations. One such individual, who's truly a maestro and has made his life's work a value proposition for all of us to see our future through his eyes and through his creativity. The one and the only Anthony Davis. How are you?
Hi, hello, thank you. Thanks for the wonderful introduction.
Yeah, it's really real when you think about a brother in opera and someone who hears opera through a cultural lens. How would you describe your voice of bringing culture, particularly Black culture, to opera in a way that will invite all of us to understand we belong there?
Well, I think when I first Opera X, when I first started to do that, I what I wanted to bring is to really reinvent opera as an American form, as our form, particularly African American form, that's built also on, traditions, like for me, like, the whole traditions of jazz have been so influential for me, so, building on what Duke Ellington and Charles Mingus and Thelonious Monk and all these great artists and I've done in the past, as well as the classical music to create a new kind of form for opera that could be both have the legacy of the European traditions, but also the African American traditions, particularly the improvised traditions.
When you think about the movement as a creative, you've often brought in the tragedy that we've experienced as a people to that opera stage. Why are you such a great storyteller in giving compassion and a new lens to our truth?
Well, I think that's to me there are those so many great stories to tell, and without Malcolm X was of course that was a give. I was so excited to when we first embarked on that journey, creating an opera based on Malcolm's life because Malcolm was such a powerful influence on everyone, on me and everyone at the time, and with Central Park Five too, it's another story that living in New York in 1989 when this happened, I was well aware of it, and also seeing how those events transpired and kind of the beginning of Donald Trump's political career, which began with the central persecution of the Central Park Five. And now we see, Yusef Salaam is a city councilman now in New York, and Raymond Santana is also running for city council. So it's amazing, how their lives have turned, and now I guess they're suing Donald Trump too for defamation. So, but I think that with this case in particular, what happened to them was an indication of what the future was going to be with Donald Trump.
And you captured this nuance, and you're in Detroit. Now, what's it feel like to know that both you are, as a transmitter of truth and creativity, have created this sonic boom right in Detroit in a moment when everybody is once again having to revisit the fact that the Central Park Five deserve this opera, and we need to see it through your voice?
Yeah, I think I think I like to hope that art has an impact. To me, one of the reasons I create the art that I do is to have an impact in society, to make an impression, to capture those moments, those pivotal moments that of transformation, where that define who we are today and define, and point toward the future. So that's something I really think about when I'm creating it and the subject matter I take. I try to think of, what can capture this moment and what can speak to this moment.
Describe at least three moments in the Central Park Five musical moments that you want people to tune into when they come in and just begin to experience something that they've never before. Your beauty of bringing this whole tragedy to life.
Well, I think there are a number of moments. One thing that comes to mind is the just before the exhilaration of these young people, they were 15, 16 years old at the time when they were initially going into the park, going into Central Park. And it's really interesting because it all the terminology around it, they would say they were wilding in the park. And wilding actually comes from the Tone Loc song Wild Thing, which is the song they were singing when they were going in the park. So I was trying to capture that exhilaration, the youthful exhilaration. I mean, some of it's truck, they're turning over trash cans and doing stuff like that. But but to capture that, so I did a parody of a Parliament funkadelic song that comes in, We Are the Freaks, which is in my operas, We Are the Freaks. And yeah, but I was trying to capture that moment, that feeling of trying to break out, trying to 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 realize, be feel free, etc. So and then that's crushed when they're arrested and stuff. So that's one moment. Another moment is Sharon Shabazz, who's Shabaz's mother, has an aria in which she talks about how they're convicting her son without, the how they've targeted him, so and her aria is it's very moving. I tried to write something that was very direct and very emotional. And then the interrogation music is very interesting because I try to capture how they force confessions, from the five. So that trying to get them to turn on each other, trying to use, I was trying to imagine what it was like. So the music sort of carries it. They're using a lot repetition sometimes, etc. And this rhythmic drive. So there's this you feel this relentlessness of the interrogation, and you have a sense that of the time passing, like 36 hours without food and water, et cetera, so. And then those moments when they sing together, the five sing together, they sing in harmony. It's kind of inspired by all those, male vocal groups, the whole tradition. You go from Detroit, from Smokey Robinson and the Miracles and all that stuff, to, Take Six and, Boys to Men, et cetera, so that the use of kind of close harmony that characterizes, you know, African American vocal music, group, especially group music. I wanted to have that in the opera, so the five are singing together, and it's kind of plaintive, and they're worried about how people look at them, how they see them. And then when they're marched out of the court after the conviction, they sit about the flashing light bulbs that blinded them as they leaving the courtroom. So that those moments, and then Corey's aria, when Corey finally is released from prison. He had a different experience from the others because he was in prison, in an adult prison he was tried as an adult. So he was in prison for 13 years. The others were released after 7, in a youth detention rather than adult prison. And so he feels this a resentment when he comes in. He feels like they stole from me, about the life, the years, the pound of flesh that they took from him. So that's very painful. That painful moment is captured in Corey's aria.
For those who've never had an opportunity to understand what an aria is, can you describe it for those individuals?
Well, aria is a song. It's a song. It comes with a word, like air, but aria, it's this idea of the song and the expression of an individual. So in this case, it's the plaintive expression of his pain, his feeling of his pain, etc. And a lot of times an aria is a chance to show the inner the feelings of a character, the the emotions of the character, what underlies what's going on, and so so those aria moments, like Sharon Javaz has 2 arias in it, and certainly Corey's arias are prime examples of that.
You pick a subject where you're taking up space on a stage and bringing people to your universe. Take us into your lab when you first decide that you've got an idea. Do you hear it in your mind? Can you see it in completion? And how do you hear and feel the music coming to you as you create what you is just beautiful. It's obviously an award-winning opera, but how does it come? What's your creative process for those who are really trying to say, he pulled the funkadelics out, he brought in harmony, he brought in the whole black canon, and then still did it on a stage in an anticipated environment.
Well, I think what it is, well, I hear it. I start working in an opera. Sometimes I have a piano and I play stuff and I get ideas, and then I kind of try to think about what's next, and I hear it in my head, what I want, and then I hear then sometimes I laugh because I discover things. I think there's a process of discovery that happens when you write a piece. That's that's in many ways the most exciting part. Like when you're not sure of where it's going to go, and then you have to trust yourself that you're going to find it, and then it comes to you. It's like I say, like I was writing an aria for the Mask, and the Mask, Harlem, a black and tan fantasy. So that those in Richard's lyrics, and I said, oh God, it's going to Duke Ellington here, the black and tan fantasy. That's 1927 Duke. So I thought, so I began to think of Harlem, and then all the manifestations of Harlem, Harlem through Ellington's eyes, Harlem through the 60s, Harlem through, then later Harlem through the eyes of these young men, growing up in Harlem in the 80s. So I think, thinking about that, the whole transformation of Harlem. And so I wanted to capture the old Harlem too. So some of that is in there, like there's a kind of Ellington Mingus kind of melody that's in there. And then I was thinking of Ellington's Harlem Suite. And then then it goes into, I actually bring in some aspect of black and tan fantasy. You hear the blues underneath when they're in the prison. They're singing a blues that's related to the stop time in black and tan fantasy. So but these are all because they were in the lyrics. He suggested it to me. So I said, so I had to carry it out into the score.
Thank you for that. You've had a beautiful journey. If you were going to talk about taking up spaces, which you've done so beautifully, about our history, for young musicians, what do you challenge them to do as it relates to taking over opera stages and building out their spaces and really tackling subjects that people wouldn't imagine would come to stage?
Well, I think that's what it is. Don't accept in a way. I mean, one thing I realized is that some people accept certain limitations. Like a limitation. Like, they'll never do Malcolm X. They'll never do that. And I said, well, no, no, no. If you don't do it, they're not going to do it. So to me, it's saying, imagining, like, allow your imagination the freedom to see things that haven't been done before. That to create something that allows you to imagine your own freedom. There are no limitations to what you can do, and no limitations to what your art can be. And if you can imagine that, then that frees your mind, so you're able to create things that are not necessarily in the mold of the possible, but creating a new possible.
That's amazing. There's this guy, Henry Louis Gates. He tends to fashion the stories of those who have no idea they have a connection to history, to moments in time. How do the two of you speak about, as brothers, just the nuances? Because you're doing this in this land that truly you're taking over the stage and are Hannibal to some degree. You're Paul Robeson to some degree, taking up space and giving us a presence and a history lesson to something we might want to forget or might not be able to be exposed to if you didn't expose us to what you've done. Thank you, I'd like to say.
No, I know. I mean, I think it's important. Skip and I, we're close friends, and Henry Louis Gates. We went to college together at Yale. We were at Yale at the same time, and he was the best man at my wedding. So, so we're partners in crime in many respects. So think about, all all he's given to, to this world too, from his initial book about the signifying monkey, which was very inspiring to me. And it introduced to me, like, for example, the Yoruba deities, like Eshu, the trickster god, actually has appeared in my operas, a number of my operas and stuff. But it's like the intersection of the real world and the imaginative world, that the imaginative world is influenced by the real world, and then you hopefully your imaginative world has some impact in the real world. So that's something that I've taken a heart, and being around people like Henry Louis Gates and Wally Soyinka was at Yale when we were there, and others, was inspiring to me to realize also that our connection to our history. Our history is so nuanced. There's so much in our history. I mean, there's so many stories that we can tell, from our history, and there's an attempt today, with to bury our history, to erase it. And I think that as artists, we have to fight that with everything we have.
Thank you for that. The very presence of your work in this orchestra, to be a individual like yourself who now has command, obviously you mentioned Ellington, but now you've got this sound coming in an unexpected way, to be able to paint through this opera in Motown. What does that feel like, to have all that power behind your creativity at that moment?
Well, it's very exciting to me. Always excited to come back to Detroit because I know so many musicians from Detroit. I mean, Detroit has such a rich musical legacy, and from Motown, and also the great jazz artists from, we could talk about the Jones Brothers, Paul Chambers, Charles McPherson. I could just go down the list of, the great artists. My one of my close friends, Verona Clough, and Dwight Andrews from Detroit. So and Regina Carter. I could just keep going on. James Carter. So I could just go on, but it's such a rich legacy here in music. And I had the good fortune of coming here, as a jazz musician a number of times, performing here. Yeah, and always was a great experience. And then to come back now with operas, X I did a couple years ago, and now Central Park Five, is really rewarding. And also working with musicians from Detroit, that I always have improvisers within the ensemble, and the improvisers in Detroit are at the highest level. They're fantastic. It's just so it's been a wonderful experience for me.
You talked about, can you share the power of being able to improvise and how to use it, and why it's important for our imaginations to understand improvising?
Well, I think improvising is I mean, I'm an improviser myself, and it comes from, but also I wanted to incorporate that into opera because I wanted that makes every performance of the opera unique. It's not going to be exactly the same every time, because you have the role of the improviser, and the fact that, and this kind of interaction of that with the music, to have these occasions for musicians to really rise to the music, and that's been very exciting for me to work with, and kind of part of my original conception of opera was to bring the improviser into opera. That opera could have both the, composed and fixed elements in it, but at the same time allow the freedom and the creativity of the musicians within it.
Well, I want to thank you for what you give. And the last thing I would ask, if you could have a conversation with these two individuals, one was called Satchmo and the other is called Duke Ellington, what would the title of your conversation between those two men be, as it relates to creating show and creativity for the world to see?
Well, that's interesting. Well, I had a chance to speak with Duke Ellington. when I was a freshman at Yale, Duke Ellington came and he looked at me across the room, and I had this huge afro, this like Angela Davis afro, right? So he pointed at me all the way across from me. He said, "You must be a musician." Of course I was. So I walked over and I started talking with Duke Ellington, and Satchmo I never had a chance to talk to, but I would love to, talk about how inspiring his music has been, and what it was like growing up in New Orleans and creating this music that he did, and Ellington, I would talk, to talk about those black, brown, and beige and Harlem Suite, all those incredible masterpieces that he wrote that have been influential in my music, And I think with Duke it's funny. I probably talk about my great uncle who was a really close friend of Ellington's, and I didn't realize that at the time when I met Duke that I didn't until I read his autobiography, and he talked about my uncle Arthur. I realized, I said, oh wow. They went to high school together. So I want to talk about that. I would talk a lot about Ellington's profound influence on music today.
Thank you for that. For all those who are going to come, Central Park 5 is a moment in time, just like to celebrate you, Brother Anthony Davis, the award winning composer, creative, beautiful spirit that dawns our community with hope and a possibility, endless possibilities, how we should see and celebrate ourselves. So thank you for coming on Arts
Oh,
and
thanks for inviting me. Great to meet you.
Thank you.